So in Western countries especially, there is this ridiculous prevailing narrative that the British Empire ended because it suddenly grew a conscience and allowed all the former colonies to have peaceful independence. This is of course nonsense. In fact, quite the opposite is true. When the British Empire was in its death spiral in the 1950s, it reached one of the most brutally violent points in its history. And nowhere is this better demonstrated than in Kenya. In the 1920s, British occupation forces began to seize all the fertile land in Kenya, reserving it for European settlers only. This displaced tens of thousands of Kenyans and destroyed the local market economy in favour of cash crop exports to Europe. Mainly tea, of course. None of the money this generated was shared with the Kenyan people or invested in the Kenyan economy, despite the fact Kenyan labourers did all the work. It was total colonial extraction and exploitation. Peaceful protesters began petitioning the British government for Kenyan political and land rights within their own country. These petitions were met with violent reprisals from British police. But after the Second World War, the British Empire was mortally wounded, its pride destroyed from the fall of Singapore and the growing global liberation movements. So the British began violently cracking down even harder on Kenyan protesters in a desperate attempt to save their crumbling empire. This drove Kenyan protesters to pick up arms and begin armed resistance against the British occupation. This period has come to be known as the Mau Mau Rebellion. In revenge, the British Army began kidnapping Kenyan civilians as hostages, including women and children. More than 1.5 million Kenyans were put into concentration camps, where British soldiers frequently conducted torture, starvation and executions to encourage the rebels to surrender. This predictably backfired and only fanned the flames of revolution even further. The violent resistance against British occupation would go from 1952 to 1960. More than 2,000 British soldiers and loyalists died in the fighting, and more than 100,000 Kenyan civilians were killed by the British. Despite the incredibly one-sided death toll, ultimately it was the British that could not sustain the violence any longer. By 1960, the British Empire was an empire in name only, and the sheer cost of the violence was unsustainable as Britain continued to lose colonies all over the world to independence movements. Jomo Kenyatta declared Kenyan independence in 1963 and became the first president. The victory for Kenya was, however, short-lived, as not long after they kicked the British occupation out, the victorious Kenyans would face a new nightmare as US corporations, the CIA and US military moved on the fragile nation, and Kenya's resource extraction and exploitation under neocolonialism continues to this day. But if you've been paying attention at all to Kenyan politics over the past 20 years, you know that the spirit of resistance is very much alive, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if Kenya becomes the next African nation to rise up against neocolonialism and declare true independence, just like the Sahel nations have already done in West Africa. Anyway, kitu cha kufikiria.